want to start today with an urban design wake-up call. And I want to tell you about my first public participation meeting, where many years ago I presented my first urban design project. It was a slick, glossy drawing. It was a beautiful design that I presented to a community hall of 300 people on a government housing waiting list. It was for a 175-unit low-income housing project, and it was filled to the brim with innovative design solutions, creative thinking, and all the necessary supportive jargon. At the end of the meeting, I sat down. I was very proud of myself, as you can imagine. An elderly lady made her way up from the back of the hall. And in a softly spoken voice, she said to me, she hadn't understood anything I'd said. She hadn't understood anything that I'd drawn. What she wanted to know was if all of that meant that she would no longer be sleeping in a bathtub at night. See, it turns out that she was renting the cramped bathroom of a nearby house and calling that her home. And in asking me that question, she challenged me. She'd participated, and she left me changed. And that's why I'm standing here today. Because what I realized is that the most dangerous place for me to design a city from is from a desk, or from a place of privilege. See, as an urban designer, we're tasked with the making of the public realm. That's creating the places, the spaces, and the experiences that connect the often insulated bubbles that we choose to live in. It's a very messy profession, and I often negotiate the contested spaces between the urban real and the urban imagined. You see, as an urban designer, I work a lot in the space where I'm negotiating, I'm trying to understand agendas. And what I've realized is one of the most amazing things is you, the value of active participation. So look around. That's you. I value you. And as I work as an urban designer, I see this aching contradiction that bothers me, and I want it to bother you too, which is the widening inequality that we see, the poverty, and knowing that this is all happening in one of the most constitutionally progressive countries in the world. Our right to speak out is really watered down by our inability to speak truth. And you see, local and provincial government, they subscribe to a policy of public participation. But it's an abbreviation of the constitutional ideal. Often we're left to submitted commentary. And as a brave public, we have to argue why plans should not be implemented, why policies should not be accepted. It's a very difficult space to be in. There's a lack of robust dialogue, and government is merely obliged to apply its mind to these objections. So the problem really is that South African urbanism is still dangerously being designed from behind a desk, using the same glossy plans that I used and that same exclusive design rhetoric that I used. This lack of robust dialogue is really deafening, and what it does is it breeds apathy, dissociation, and distrust in those who can afford not to care. And rightly, for those people who feel like nobody cares, it evokes outrage and resentment. So my disruptive question was this: how can the majority of the participants and the inhabitants of our city speak when this language of change is spoken by so few? Or in other words, instead of 175 urban designers, what would our cities look like if South Africa was made up of 45 million urban designers? And that's really my question, was how do we do that? So I looked to the open source model for some help. And in the technology world, open source really invites an unearthing or an exposure of this hidden design source code, much like the design source code of the city. It invites people to collaborate. It invites people to tweak, ideally leaving an enhanced product contributed to by many and not owned by the few. And you can see why in South African cities that would be a really great idea. Of course, the assumption is that in an open source collaborative effort, that everyone is fluent in the design language or the coding language. And of course, when we apply this to cities, this is where it becomes very interesting, because you're asking yourself, can I speak city? And the answer is yes. We are all fluent in a non-verbal, intuitive language of space making. When you walk through the city, you know those spaces where you're feeling forced to move more quickly, those spaces where you feel like you could possibly parade, or spaces where you feel vulnerable. Similarly, you know the spaces where you would like to move more slowly, the spaces you'd like to feel safer, and perhaps where you'd also still like to parade. So the way I like to think of open source methodology is really a bit like a community garden, where everyone gets to share in the spoils of getting their hands dirty, rather than shopping the aisles of a grocery store for a prepackaged broccoli. So, as designers, what we really need to do is we need to stop looking to Google to understand what best practice is. And we need to get onto the streets and understand how to build successful cities by first building successful relationships. So designers, I'm calling you guys out today. And what I'm saying is that we can no longer afford to be vendors of trend or initiators of the spectacular. But what we really need to do is two things. Firstly, we need to disrupt ourselves by getting onto the street. We need to disrupt ourselves by understanding what it is that we see when we're on the street. And that's really the second part of my talk today, which is, remember when I said I had to get out from behind my desk to design? Well, this is the part where I understand how it is that I listen. What do I see when I'm on the street? So my question to you, designers, change makers, how do you view poverty? When you walk onto the street today, what is it that you think and feel? This year, my family and I took part in the Under the Line Challenge, which was a 3-day call to action to understand how the majority of our cities live and survive. You see, 45% of the people in our city today live on or below the poverty line. And what that means in real terms is 10 rand a day per person for everything. That's food, education, clothing, transport. For the purposes of our empathy-inducing exercise, we were limited to 10 rand a day per person for food. And what that really meant was, well, less choice, no overpriced coffee, and really portion sizes that left my stomach empty in order to keep my children's stomachs full. As my 7-year-old son wisely pointed out, since we were spending less, we could probably afford to give more. A second challenge that proved to be instrumental in changing the way I think about the city is when I was asked to participate in a project on bicycle commuting. I was asked to represent the needs of cyclists, and as a mom of 3, I reckon I was the least likely person to convert to bicycle commuting. So I was challenged. Either I ride a bicycle, I understand what it is to cycle, or I withdraw from the project altogether. And that's what I did. I set out for myself a 6-month experiment to say 100 kilometers a month on a bicycle, and in doing so, not only understand what cyclists need, but in fact what I would need to then become a cyclist. So the view from a bicycle proved to be spectacular. And my need to do 100 kilometers a month turned into a desire to do 100 kilometers a day. In 6 short months, I went from newbie cyclist to cycling advocate. And my head knowledge of what appropriate practice should be turned into a heart knowledge of how we cycle, how we move. You see, when you only have 10 rand a day to spend on everything, and pedaling costs you nothing, there's an urban design conversation to be had. As I cycle, I realize the anti-fragility of the bicycle and the changing commuter landscape, and I realize there's opportunity for change. What did I learn from these 2 challenges? Well, I learned that really I didn't need an urban design qualification to change the way I think about the city and to make a real change. The other thing I realized is that when I present design ideas, born out of an authenticity and having challenged myself, it's a far more compelling argument to local government then presenting a list of design ideals and demanding change. How you can get involved, because you are urban designers and you are change makers, and we will be a country of 45 million people who are engaged in the way that cities are made. So, now that I'm very excited about cycling, I've entered my first event, which is it's not a small one, it's big. It's a 730-kilometer race through the Karoo next week. And, yes, go big or go home, and, or go to the Karoo. And my neighbors see me cycling. They see me cycling, and we talk about cycling. And they tell me about when the streets used to be safer for their children to ride. And I thought, well, why don't we do something about that? 6 houses, all in a row, neighbors who want to change the way that the world is. I have traffic cones, and every Sunday we'll be shutting down the street and turning our road into a place where our children can ride safely. And so, what I want to encourage you guys to do is speak to your neighbors, get onto the street, be change agents, be urban designers. Because open source urban design is really, it's not about my city. Open source urban design says, it's our city. Open source urban design says, it's not my design language. It says, it's our intervention. And open source urban design says, I'm really nobody trying to tell everybody that there's somebody when it comes to changing our city. Thanks very much.